Get out of my way, Megan. This doesn't concern you. Those were the last words my sister said to me before she signed the papers. I'm still sitting with that sentence 3 years later, still turning it over in my hands like a stone I can't put down. My name is Megan Calloway. I'm 39 years old. I'm sitting in the living room of the house I grew up in, the same house my parents told me for 20 years would go to my sister, Stephanie. The same house I was told in 100 different ways I would never deserve. I need you to stay with me for this entire story, because if you leave early, you'll think this is a story about a bitter daughter getting revenge on her perfect sister. It's not. This is a story about what love actually looks like when nobody is watching, when there's no inheritance on the line, when there's nothing left to gain. And if that sounds like something you need to hear right now, please like this video before we go any further. It helps more people find stories like this one. And this one? I think a lot of people need it. Let me take you back to 1994. I was 10 years old. Stephanie was 14. We lived in a pale blue house on Birchwood Lane in Cincinnati, Ohio. My father, Thomas Calloway, was a high school football coach. My mother, Margaret, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 3 blocks away. We were not rich, but we were comfortable, and we were supposed to be a family. I say supposed to because from the very beginning, the lines were drawn in ways nobody ever admitted out loud. Stephanie was the beautiful one, the social one, the one who made my parents look good at dinner parties. She had my mother's cheekbones and my father's confidence, and she knew exactly how to use both. I was the quiet one, the reader, the one who spent Saturday mornings at the library while Stephanie spent them at cheerleading practice with my mother in the bleachers, beaming. It wasn't that my parents were cruel to me. I want to be precise about this. They fed me, they clothed me, and they showed up to my school plays. But there is a difference between being present and being seen. And I was never quite seen. I remember being 12 years old and winning a writing competition at school. State level. My essay was going to be published in an anthology. I came home with the certificate, hands shaking with excitement. My mother looked at it and said, "That's nice, honey." Then she turned back to the kitchen counter where she was helping Stephanie practice for her homecoming court speech. I took that certificate upstairs and put it in a shoebox under my bed. I still have that shoebox. I'm looking at it right now from across the room. By the time I was 16, the dynamic was so established that it had become invisible. The way wallpaper becomes invisible. You stop seeing it because it's always been there. Stephanie got the car for her 16th birthday. I used Honda Civic, nothing fancy, but still, a car. When my 16th birthday came, my father said they couldn't afford it that year. Maybe next year. Next year never came. Stephanie got the college fund, $40,000 that my parents had been saving for years. She went to the University of Michigan, lived in a proper dorm, and joined a sorority. I had a conversation at the kitchen table where my father explained, very reasonably, that money was tight and I was smart enough to figure it out. I went to Cincinnati State on a combination of scholarships and loans, worked 25 hours a week at a grocery store deli counter to cover the rest, came home on weekends smelling like sliced turkey, and trying not to feel the weight of the comparison. I told myself it wasn't about fairness. I told myself families were complicated. I told myself Stephanie needed more because she was more visible, more social, more of what they understood. I told myself a lot of things in those years to keep functioning. Here's the thing about convincing yourself a wound isn't there. You get very good at it. And then one day something small happens. something tiny and almost meaningless, and the whole careful structure falls apart. For me, that moment came on a Sunday afternoon in March 2009. I was 24, I'd graduated, started working as an office manager at a small healthcare company, and was building something quiet and real for myself. I came home for my mother's birthday dinner. Stephanie was there with her boyfriend at the time, a finance guy named Brad who wore boat shoes indoors. She'd just accepted a marketing job in Chicago. Big salary, exciting city. My parents were glowing. My father kept saying, "Stephanie's really doing it," to everyone at the table. Like the rest of us weren't also in the room doing things. After dinner, while my mother was cutting the cake, my father pulled Stephanie aside in the hallway. I was in the kitchen doorway. I don't think he saw me. He said, "Stephanie, your mother and I have been talking. When the time comes, the house, everything, it goes to you. You're the one who's going places. We want to make sure you're taken care of." Stephanie said, "Dad, you don't have to." He said, "We want to. You've earned it." I stood in that kitchen doorway holding 2 dessert plates. I didn't say anything. I put the plates on the table, said I had an early morning, hugged my mother, and drove home. I sat in my apartment parking lot for 40 minutes before I went inside. And something very quiet shifted in me that night. Not dramatically, not with anger or tears, just a door closed somewhere. Gently, but permanently. I want to be clear about something. I did not stop loving my parents that night. That is not what happened. What happened was I stopped waiting. I stopped waiting to be chosen, stopped waiting for the scales to balance, stopped organizing my sense of worth around whether they finally noticed me. I started building my life, fully, completely, without that particular hole in the center. I got a certification in healthcare administration, then another one. I moved up in the company. By 2013, I was managing operations for 3 clinic locations. I met my husband Daniel at a work conference in 2014. He was a logistics coordinator from Portland with a dry sense of humor and the rare ability to actually listen when someone was talking. We got married in 2016 in a small ceremony. My parents came. My father spent most of the reception talking to Daniel about football. Stephanie was my maid of honor because that was what was expected. We were polite to each other. We had always been polite to each other. Politeness was the language we spoke when love wasn't available. My parents got older. This is the part of the story that nobody tells you about until you're living it. Getting older doesn't happen the way you expect. It's not a single moment. It's a slow accumulation of smaller moments. A forgotten appointment, a phone call that gets a little more confusing, a fall that shouldn't have happened, a diagnosis that arrives on a Tuesday and rearranges everything. My father's dementia diagnosis came in October 2018. He was 71. I found out because my mother called me, not Stephanie, me, in a panic at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday. She said he'd gotten up in the night, gotten dressed, and tried to leave the house because he thought he was late for football practice. Football practice he hadn't attended in 30 years. I drove to Cincinnati that same day, 4 hours. Stephanie called that evening to say she was sorry, but she had a work trip she couldn't cancel. I stayed for 4 days. I went to the neurologist with my mother. I sat with my father while he had good hours and bad hours. I made lists of medications, emergency contacts, and daily routines. Then I drove home and went back to work. And then I came back the next month, and the month after that. Stephanie sent a flower arrangement for my father's birthday in January 2019. It was beautiful. Lilies and white roses in a tall glass vase. I drove 4 hours and took him to his favorite diner for pancakes. He called me Stephanie twice during breakfast. I said, "That's okay, Dad," both times. And I meant it. That is the part that surprises me most when I look back. I genuinely meant it. By 2020, my mother's health had started declining too. Her knees were bad. She'd had 2 minor cardiac events that her doctor described as warning shots. She was exhausted from caring for my father and refusing to admit it. I started coming every 3 weeks, sometimes every 2. Daniel never complained, not once. He'd pack my bag with me, make sure I had good podcasts for the drive, and text me every night I was away. He said once, "You're a good daughter, Megan." I said, "I don't know what I am. I'm just showing up." He said, "That's the same thing." I've thought about that a lot. Stephanie and I had a phone call in February 2021 that I think about often. She called to tell me she'd been promoted, Vice President of Marketing. I told her congratulations and meant it. Then she said, almost as an afterthought, "How are Mom and Dad doing? I keep meaning to call more." I was standing in my parents' kitchen when she said this. I had driven up that morning because my mother had called the night before, sounding frightened. My father had had a difficult episode. I looked around that kitchen. The medication organizer I had bought and labeled, the printed schedule in the refrigerator in my handwriting, the grab bar I had installed next to the stove myself with a drill and a YouTube tutorial. I said, "They're managing. It would mean a lot to them if you called." She said, "Of course, absolutely. I'll call this week." I don't know if she called that week. I wasn't there to hear it. The real turning point came in the summer of 2022. My mother fell in the backyard. Not a serious fall, no breaks, no hospital, but a fall that frightened her badly enough that she finally admitted what I had been watching build for 2 years. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't manage the house, manage my father, manage her own health all at the same time. We needed to talk about the future. I called Stephanie. I said, "Stephanie, we need to have a real conversation about Mom and Dad. I think we need to figure out a plan together." There was a pause. She said, "I've actually been thinking about this. I talked to a few places. There are some really good facilities near me in Chicago. Memory care for Dad, assisted living for Mom. I can send you some brochures." I said, "You want to put them in a facility?" She said, "Megan, be realistic. Neither of us can take them in. I have a demanding job, I have the kids, and I travel constantly. These places are actually wonderful now. It's not like the old days." I said, "Stephanie, they don't want to go to a facility. I've had that conversation with Mom directly." She said, "What Mom wants and what Mom needs are 2 different things." Then she said it. "Get out of my way, Megan. This doesn't concern you." I stayed on the phone for another 30 seconds, saying nothing. Then I said, "I'll call you back." I hung up. I sat in my car in my parents' driveway in the summer heat, and I made a decision. Not an angry decision, not a spiteful decision. A quiet, clear, completely certain decision. I called Daniel. I told him what Stephanie had said. I told him what I was thinking. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." I said, "I need to know if you're with me on something that is going to be hard and expensive and take over our lives for the foreseeable future." He said, "Megan, tell me what you need." So I told him. We converted our home office into a bedroom. It took 3 weeks and cost more money than I want to think about. Daniel built the closet shelving himself on weekends. We installed a walk-in shower with a seat and safety rails. We bought a hospital-grade adjustable bed. We set up a monitoring system. We found a memory care specialist who did home visits. In September 2022, my parents moved into our home. I want to be honest about what that year looked like, because I am not going to stand here and make it sound like a warm movie montage. It was hard.
My father had nights where he didn't know where he was and became frightened and sometimes angry. There were moments of real heartbreak, watching a man who had coached hundreds of young people, who had been strong and sure of himself, look at his own hands like he didn't recognize them. My mother was grieving, not just his decline. She was grieving the marriage she remembered, the man she had known, the future she had planned. There were days I cried in the shower so she wouldn't hear me. There were days I was so tired I sat in the kitchen at midnight eating cereal because I didn't have the energy to make actual food, and didn't have the energy to go to bed either. But there were other days. Days when my father would have a clear hour and we would sit on the back porch and he would tell me stories about his early coaching years that I had never heard before. Days when my mother and I would sit at the kitchen table drinking tea and she would talk, really talk, in ways she never had when I was a child. One afternoon in the spring of 2023, my mother held my hand across the table and said, "Megan, I need to say something to you, and I need you to let me finish." I said, "Okay." She said, "I wasn't fair to you. For most of your life, I wasn't fair to you. I saw Stephanie and I saw myself, all the things I wanted to be, the confidence I didn't have, the life I imagined, and I poured everything into her because of that. It had nothing to do with you. You were never less. You were never not enough. That was my failure, not yours." She was crying by the end. I held her hand and let her finish. Then I said, "I know, Mom. I've known for a long time, and I forgave you before you asked." She said, "How?" I said, "Because holding on to it was too heavy, and I needed my hands free to build something." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "When did you become so wise?" I said, "Around the time I stopped waiting for you to notice." She laughed a little through her tears. "That is the moment I will keep for the rest of my life." Stephanie came to visit twice that year, once at Christmas, once in the spring. Both times she was polite and efficient and slightly uncomfortable in the way people are uncomfortable when they're confronted with a reality they've been avoiding. She brought expensive gifts, wine for me and Daniel, a cashmere blanket for my mother, and specialty chocolates. She did not bring herself, if you understand the difference. My father passed away in August 2023, peacefully, in the adjustable bed in the room that used to be our home office, with my mother holding one hand and me holding the other. He had a good last week, more clarity than he had in months. He knew where he was, he knew who we were.
On one of his last afternoons, he looked at me for a long time and said, "Megan, I didn't always see you right." I said, "Dad, you don't have to." He said, "Let me say it. I didn't always see you right, but I see you now. I see exactly who you are." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "You're the one who showed up." I said, "I know." He said, "That matters. That's the whole thing. That's all of it." He died 4 days later. After the funeral, Stephanie and I sat in the kitchen together for the first time in years without anyone else in the room. She looked around the house, the grab bars, the medication system, the marks on the wall where we'd made adjustments over the months. She said, quietly, "You did all of this." I said, "We did, Daniel and I." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have been here." I said, "Yes, you should have." No anger, no performance, just the plain truth offered and received. She said, "I told myself they'd be better off in a good facility. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself—" She stopped. I said, "You told yourself a lot of things." She said, "Yes." I said, "I know how that works."
She looked at me. I said, I told myself things for years too, Stephanie, about our family, about what I deserved, about what fairness looked like. We both had things we told ourselves. She started to cry then, really cry, and I did something I hadn't planned to do. I put my arm around my sister. She leaned into it like she was 12 years old, and we sat there in that kitchen for a long time, saying nothing. My mother still lives with us. She's doing well, all things considered. Her knees are better since the replacement surgery last spring. She has a good doctor she trusts. She joins us for dinner every night and has recently become completely obsessed with a British baking show that she and Daniel watch together on Thursday evenings. She and I have a relationship now that I genuinely could not have imagined when I was 24. It is honest, it is warm, it is real. Stephanie and I are a work in progress. We talk on the phone every couple of weeks. She visited again last month, and she and my mother had a long conversation that I deliberately gave them privacy for. I don't know exactly what was said. I know my mother cried. I know Stephanie did too. That's enough for me to know. Oh, and the house on Birchwood Lane. After my father passed, my mother decided, without prompting from anyone, she called a lawyer, and she called Stephanie, and she called me. She said the house would go to me, not as a reward, not as a transaction. She said, Megan was the one who showed up. I want her to have the home. Stephanie didn't contest it. She said, that's right. That's what should happen. I didn't take it to prove anything. I took it because it was the right call, and because that pale blue house on Birchwood Lane deserved to belong to someone who understood the full weight of it. Every room, every mark on every wall. The shoebox is still there, under the bed in the room that used to be mine. The writing certificate is still inside it. I'm going to frame it. Not because I need validation from 1994 anymore, but because that 12-year-old girl put her certificate in a box and kept going anyway, and she deserves to see it on a wall. If you're watching this and you're the child who was always in the background, the quiet one, the one who didn't get the car or the college fund or the beaming look across the table, I need you to hear this directly. The love you gave without receiving equal love back was not weakness. It was not foolishness. It was not something you should be ashamed of. It was the real thing in the room. And the people who needed it, even the ones who never found the right words, they felt it. My father told me in his last week that I was the one who showed up. That was his way of saying, I love you, in the most honest language he had. It was enough. It was more than enough. Keep showing up. Not for the inheritance, not for the recognition, not for the moment when they finally see you. Show up because it's who you are. The rest has a way of finding its place. Thank you for sitting with the story today. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs it. I'll see you in the next one.